When I was reading about your case, I was completely horrified, because I think if you've been in education, you can see the way it's going. You can see the way it's moving. It's not just your case. We've seen Batley Grammar School with what happened, their refusal to stand up for a teacher when they were talking about controversial issues. Do you think we've now reached a point where that battle is actually lost? And do you think, as Eric Kaufman, who we had sitting in your seat, said, that what we need is government intervention at this point in universities, but probably also in schools as well?
Yeah, I know there are people who argue that it's lost. Jordan Peterson is saying now, send your kids to trade school. I don't think it's maybe that extreme. I think the US has gone further than we have. I think that there's still a chance to turn things around in the UK. And the reason this particular point of principle meant a lot to me is that it's never been litigated. So the Equality Act has never been used in this way before. So when I found out that this was both a novel and activist interpretation of the Equality Act, no teacher's ever fallen foul of this idea of curriculum content being fine for students but not for staff. I thought it was one that would be worth pushing because so much is at stake.
In the spirit of this abrasion in order to create better understanding, let me try and imagine some counterpoints. I'll be honest, it's not easy for me because I agree with almost everything you've said. But if I try, surely there are certain things that should not be taught in school. Would we agree with that?
Well, you want to think about the fact that curriculum content is excluded by law. Yeah. So that would seem to give a kind of carte blanche, but nobody actually really thinks that. It's got to be age appropriate. Yeah. You've got to have it in the correct kind of context. But the thing for me is, if the flagship debating course of one of the country's leading educational institutions, which has a debating hall and every boarding house has a debate room in it, isn't the appropriate context, then what is?
Agreed. And I mean,
I'll give you another one.
I'm really struggling here, man. Help me out.
I would
What's
say
a good counter argument?
So you sometimes get people who say, look, I'm all for free speech, but it's different in schools. Teachers are in a position of authority, and you have to be very careful about what ideas you are being seen to give the nod of approval to.
Yeah.
What would your response be to that? I can think of one.
Well, I mean, in this case, it's a debate, right? And you're encouraging the kids to push back and to work out what the truth is for themselves. So you're not presenting them with this as fact. You're saying when you go out into the big bad world, and by the way, it's going to be a year from now or 2 years from now, right? You're going to be confronted by these ideas, and it's helpful to you to have actually thought about them before and considered them and rejected elements of them so that you know what you bloody think.
Yeah, knowing what you think through engaging with the other side is certainly a very strong justification for being challenged. I think it also, if you really dig down to what that objection is driving at, is, okay, so there are some dangerous ideas, are there? Which are the viewpoints that we must be very careful that teachers aren't being seen to personally uphold? And once you ask that kind of question and get those ideas explicitly laid out, then I think what you'll find is it starts to move towards very much the woke direction. Those are the official viewpoints that institutions are willing to give the seal of approval to. And teachers who question them or want boys to at least consider arguments for and against are seen as undermining the institutional project.
Well, I wonder, I'm a big fan of history. How do you teach the history of World War II without educating boys about the motivating factors behind Nazism, for example, right? And in order to teach them that, they have to understand, right? Now, by teaching them about Adolf Hitler, you're not approving of him, right? But if you were to present a lecture on how the Nazis came to the viewpoints that they did, I suppose in this case, it could be seen by somebody as a hostile environment because, as my great-grandparents died in the Holocaust, well, I could claim it's a hostile environment for me. So this is a slippery slope that I think goes to hell very, very quickly.
Exactly. Taking that example, you could have a history teacher who, by being asked to allow students to study Mein Kampf and critically evaluate its arguments, says, hostile environment for me, I refuse to teach this book, and the students won't be studying it either. So that's why the fact that it's a teacher saying it's offensive to that particular teacher to let students weigh up the pros and cons of the arguments is really what the heart of this is. It's not students saying, well, we think it's offensive. The government advice is clear there. It doesn't matter if you think it's offensive. but it's this claim that that only applies to students, not staff. So then whose personal sense of offence gets to determine what curriculum content is? Because I'd be willing to bet a lot of money on the fact that if I took offence to a forceful presentation of patriarchy as merely a social construct, as offensive to me as a man, I don't think that would achieve very much.
I'd love to see that, how that worked out.
Straight white male teacher from Eton.
But this is the asymmetry, right?
Yeah, of
Because
course.
I'm not trying to shut down anybody's views.
Yeah.
I think they should all be heard, and the more the better,
Yeah.
because it gives people more arguments to get their teeth into.
Yeah.
And why is there that asymmetry? It seems to be a kind of, I think it's ultimately a kind of lack of belief in reason and debate itself.
It's also lack of belief in your own argument, I feel. They feel that their arguments are weak, and the only way to get them to be embedded in all these institutions is that no one ever gets to challenge them. I think that's a lot of it. I honestly do.
I think that is certainly an important factor, but remember that one of the main tenets of postmodernism is actually that truth itself is a kind of social construct. Now, you can explode that fairly quickly by saying, well, so is it true there's no truth? And then it starts to fall apart.
Yeah.
So it's necessarily false. But if you honestly don't believe there is such a thing as truth, then why have the debate?
Yeah.
If it's all just about power, then just stop the narrative you don't like being heard and reduce its power. So I think there's that element to it as well.
Isn't also part of it as well is that even, I don't know how old you are, Will.
35.
You're 35, right. So, but if you remember when we grew up, our generation, right, I'm playing age 35 to 28.
You're a bit
Shut up.
older, mate.
I'm nearly 40. I'm fine with it.
He's very fine with it.
I'm very fine with it. But there was a rough and tumble aspect to our childhood that I think, being a teacher is going to make me sound old, has been lost from our society. We want to wrap kids up in cotton wool. We want to protect them. And that may be, they want to protect them from physical harm, but we also want to protect them from psychological harm. Do you think that's part of it as well?
Well, I don't think anybody, at least at the outset, was trying to protect kids from any kind of psychological harm. It was an adult saying, I can't possibly cope with allowing kids to discuss this. For me, one of the markers of adulthood is actually being willing to seek out intellectual and emotional challenge. And I think people retard their own development if they don't deliberately seek that out, because you just stay in your comfort zone continually. That's seen as a bad thing in many walks of life. And I think in intellectual life, it should be the same. You should be taking sides against yourself in order to find out fully what you really think. If you do say that kids always need to be kept safe, then the counter-argument would be, just as with avoidance, with anxiety, actually entrenching anxiety, I think it just means that the range of ideas you're willing to explore and able to explore narrows and narrows and narrows.
And what